You had mentioned that, there were districts that were not, wildly spending in parties or whatnot. We know that's untrue. We know clearly what happened with, Newark Public Schools with the, having to refund the state for their wasteful spending for exactly that, for a party with open bar. And, we know about the balloons, et cetera. So there is wasteful spending. To be fair, all public schools are capable of that. We've had an instance of a public charter school behaving very badly and rightfully held accountable. So I would just caution to not gloss over those cases. Everybody needs to be treated fairly when we're talking about public money, and it does nobody any benefit by glossing over the fact that there is mismanagement of funds that the state now, that the schools acknowledge and now even have to refund the state. I do have a couple direct questions for you. So you're saying that more money is necessary, and in certain cases we know for special education, I don't think there's a district in the entire state that could not benefit from additional special education funding. However, you're also advocating, for instance, for a return to Tier 1 pension benefits for all members. And I know your goal is to advocate for your members. That's what your organization does. But is there a point also, I recall, I know, Deborah, you had testified here in front of this committee regarding lifting the cap temporarily to up to 9.9% for local fair share last round when schools couldn't meet their budget. So where do you see that pressure point between the needs or perceived needs of your members and what you would like to provide for them and what you think is fair and what you honestly think is fair and realistic for the taxpayers? I mean, we have wants, and my grandfather always said to me, people in hell want ice water and they don't get it, and I hated that saying, but it really is true. We can want and want, but there is a pressure point where it ends.
So thank you for the questions. I'll be brief, and there was multi-pieces to that. I apologize if I gave the misimpression that there are problems and exceptions to the rules that we're talking about, but we do feel that when we're asking for things like transportation money and special education money, those are to go to real and documented costs, not extraneous activity. And that is a statewide problem for just about every district, to your point, that we know of. So that addresses your first point. The second, I believe, has to do with our advocacy for pension reform, as well as, so where we think there is balance, and I'll defer to my president as well to supplement here or correct me, but when you're looking at the whole picture of successful and high quality public schools, the problem that we're having with recruitment and retention is directly related to a Tier 5 pension. And what we were proposing to do at the end of last session had to do with a DCRP, a very incremental step. We believe we have to address this because the ultimate cost to our districts will be higher, in terms of bonuses that are being offered to recruit, to steal teachers from one district to the other, right? We're causing a financial problem there, but B, the loss of high quality educators in the middle of their career will ultimately affect high quality education to be delivered. The advocacy for the lift of the cap was to allow those districts who, according to the formula, not the topic today, to allow them to get to that local fair share because they were placed in an untenable position of being told that you have to meet your local fair share, but you have a 2% cap. And so there is room for us to do that. I think that there overall needs to be balance, and that's the dialogue that we're here to have and participate in, but that there are certain strains on school districts that are causing even the best administrator who does balance the budget every year, who are the majority of them, to really have to struggle to get the numbers to work and to match. So if you want to.
Yeah, I would just add, and thank you for that question, Assemblywoman. To find a balance, we're always good at collaborating. We're educators. We figure out how to negotiate contracts. We figure out how to make things work. We've shown that years ago with Chapter 44 that we were able to collaborate and come out with something that has saved the state more money than they even imagined. So I think the answer lies in how we can collaborate. We know there's a problem that exists when 70% of current educators say they would not recommend the profession to future educators, and we see over a 50% drop in the education prep programs at our state colleges, universities, and larger than ever numbers of people leaving the profession. We know we can't let that alone. But to your point of finding that balance is the question. We're ready and able to go. We've suggested things. We're ready to sit with the governor's office, with legislative leadership to work out real structural solutions that can do both things, make sure that our members, future educators, come in to a pension that they can retire on, that is not just a savings account after 42 years of service or worse in some cases, and understand there are fiscal issues, but it's also at the same time when you see on a weekend that $128 million just went out the door somewhere and no one knows where, there's also money to be found from both sides to come together and collaborate for those solutions, because every kid Every kid deserves that high-quality education regardless of where they live, their zip code, who they are, and that means we have to have the money set aside to find the educators, to make sure the schools are funded, and they're coming to nice facilities. So we can find those answers.
Thank you so
Understood.
much.
I have two more, and I'll make it quick. You had talked about charters with the transportation issue. I can tell you that honestly, charters don't enjoy waiting every month to get a check from individual districts either. That's not a good time. It would be, in my opinion, better streamlined if the state actually, kept those funds and redistributed, because charters are at the mercy every month of individual school districts actually mailing the check at the end of the month. However, I just want to acknowledge that 10% of the per pupil cost does remain in that school district. So let's say that a student was going to transfer to a charter. Aid in lieu of transportation, which is a small amount, which would most likely match that 10%, is an option. So I don't necessarily think that's a huge insurmountable gap. Also, if you have students going, for instance, in a neighboring district, let's say two towns butt against each other, there are most likely multiple children that are taking that same bus from that town. Again, if you have an outlier, there's that aid in lieu of transportation option, which I don't think is nuclear for any traditional public school district. I don't know if you feel differently, but I just want to give you a chance to say. My next question is regarding the Highlands. I know you have 200,000 members roughly in your testimony that you submitted here. Probably 35,000, 40,000 are actually working in the Highlands. And I'm curious as to what your stance is. Again, I know you're an advocacy organization. What is your stance in advocating for greater funding for those specific schools like Jefferson Township, Vernon, West Milford that are getting hammered?
Thank you so much for your question. But remember, the focus of this is about the internal audits, what internally controls that they can do. So if you want to answer her question and along with the premise of this hearing, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Where there are districts that are struggling because of what they feel are inequities in the formula, for example, in the Highlands, we've asked to take an analysis of the question of their local fair share based on what their preserved lands are, which are not ratables, and we're happy to take a look and have those discussions. It's why I'll just be brief here to say we've recommended participation in a task force to review the formula. That's where it needs to be addressed. The issues with regards to potential funding challenges for the Highlands isn't a matter of auditing or measures. It's a matter of whether or not they are getting a fair share out of the formula. And that's something we're happy to look at.